tonight we're going to be identifying and outlining the issues with our panel, and in a week we'll be rejoining here on December 6th to work on the solutions, and we'll be working in smaller groups for solutions and how we go forward from tonight. I want to thank all of our partners who are joining us this year: the ACLU, the NAACP, Miami-Dade County Community Relations Board, South Florida People of Color, SANTLA, Women's March, Coalition of South Florida Muslim Organizations, Barry University, FIU, University of Miami, Cressair, and Americans for Immigrant Justice. Thank you all.
Good evening, everybody. I think you all are aware that this past year we initiated, along with several other major organizations, an initiative called Connect Miami. And the idea of the program was to get to know each other, to cross lines of difference, and get to know people whose life may be different, their backgrounds may be different, but we're all part of one community, and we're enriched by that. So I didn't want to lose this opportunity to take a few minutes to connect. So before we start the program, I'd like you to please turn to someone next to you. If the person next to you is someone you already know, then turn the other way. Or turn to the person behind you, okay? Find someone you don't know. And here is your assignment. Here is your assignment. Hello. Please introduce yourself and then share where you came from and what brought you here to Miami. I'll give you 3 minutes. Go. Okay, so now that we got to know each other, we'll come back. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That made me feel great. So, one last little chore before we begin. This is going to be an evening where we're going to have a conversation with some very special people, people who are passionate about issues of social justice that we all care about, or you wouldn't be here tonight. We're going to have some wonderful conversations, and then we're going to have time for some questions and answers. And at MCCJ, before we start any program, we always like to establish the norms, sort of the guidelines that we're going to go by in our conversation. And when you're talking about some uncomfortable subjects, some things that we feel passionately about, sometimes things can get out of hand. So to kind of keep that under control, we're going to establish a few norms. Usually we have the group establish them, but in the interest of time, I'm going to give you a couple of norms. Okay, so one of them would be, first of all, assume the positive. So you may hear something that's a little bit, kind of makes you a little bit uncomfortable, but let's assume that everyone in this room means well. Nobody's trying to be difficult or offend or be controversial. So assume the positive. Don't get your back up too quick. Let's remember the issue of one mic, one person speaking at a time. We'll be sure everyone has a chance, but one at a time. Let's obviously have respect for whoever is speaking. And as I often tell the teenagers we work with, respect is not only in your head, it's also how you are. Like if you're not like this and like this, it's not really respectful. Okay. Obviously, we hope you'll be open-minded. You're here to learn. I know I am. Learn to be educated, learn some new ideas, some new perspectives. And also, and this one is tricky, when you do speak, use an I statement rather than a generalization. Because I can't argue with you if you're just telling me how you feel and you think. But if you try to tell me it's true, this is it, then I may, get a little uncomfortable with you. So if you're going to say red is a disgusting color, really gets me mad when I see it, as opposed to I have a problem when people wear red. I can't argue with that, right? But if you start saying, well, red is just not the thing, then I might have an argument with you. So try to go for the I statement, okay? If somebody really does say something that unnerves you, it really makes you unhappy and uncomfortable, we suggest that you just kind of go, ouch. And those of us up here will notice that. And before the evening is over, we'll come back to you and ask you, what was the problem there? Educate us. We'll learn from that. Tell us what I said that kind of gave you a little bit of discomfort. We want to learn from that. So we call that ouch and educate. So these are just some of the general norms that I hope we can all agree we're going to go by and live by this evening. I think it helps us to have a great conversation. So now it's my great pleasure to get this program on the road, and we're very fortunate that we have an outstanding moderator as well as outstanding panelists, and we are really grateful to Saifa Shuf, who is the VP for Engagement at Florida International University. And prior to that, he was the Executive Director of City Year, which is where I first met him. And I think the important thing, I'm not going to go into all the faldy-roll and fiddly-dee. I think the important thing is, of all the wonderful things he's done, awards he's won, but why? Because fundamentally, he's a human being who cares about you and me. Okay? He cares about our community. So that everything he does, coming here tonight to help us with this program, every program that he's at and attends and supports, is because he cares. And that's why he is recognized in the community as a leader. That's why we're so lucky to have him here tonight. So it's my great pleasure to welcome the VP of Engagement from FIU, Saifa Shuf.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? I think we're going to have to try that again. How's everybody doing tonight? Great, awesome. All right, great. Well, I want to go ahead and start off with a warm welcome. And being that I work in higher ed, I also want to ask all of you to join me in giving a big round of applause for our hosts tonight at Barry University. Let's give them a... Universities, in their purest sense, are places where we can have a free exchange of ideas. And tonight, that's what I'm so honored that we're going to be able to do together with this extraordinary panel of leaders in our community that are leaning into some of the most complex and challenging issues of our time. Roberta has already shared what the ground rules are. She definitely framed it in a much more genteel light than I would. I'm comfortable enough to say that respect is a two-way street, and that's really important if we want to be able to have an important conversation. And also, I think it's fitting for all of you, the time that you've given to come on out here on a night like tonight, and also for the leaders that we have here. I want to thank MCCJ for hosting us. We know that the work right now that MCCJ does in our community is needed more than ever. The idea of how it is that we can heal the divide and how it is that we can feel comfortable engaging in uncomfortable conversations with one another is really one of the only ways that we can drive the types of breakthroughs that we need. And the wide range of programs that MCCJ offers and the assemblage of leaders that are part of this great organization. Sherry Tropin, we're so fortunate to be able to have leading the charge, and Roberta and her team, we're thankful. Tonight we're going to be talking about a wide range of different topics, and I'm going to be introducing our panel in a moment, and I was so thrilled when Roberta reached out to me, because these are the types of conversations that our community deserves at every single level. Every single resident, every single person who calls South Florida home deserves to be a part of the type of dialogue that we're driving here tonight. And we have to have the type of moral imagination to engage in these discussions if we really want to get to a place of truth. And as I was reflecting on tonight, before I jump into the panel, I was thinking about this subject that we're discussing, which is part of this Can We Talk series. And if you haven't been to a Can We Talk, Can We Really Talk dialogue, then I'm so glad that you're with us tonight. This community has had a number of very, very important breakthroughs that have happened because of the Can We Talk series, including other dialogue series that have actually been born of it. And I think tonight and on the follow-up session, which we're going to be having on December 6th, this is not just about engaging in a nice, fruitful, academic, intellectual conversation, although it will have that. This is also step one in a bigger process of engaging in solutions making. And we've got some slides that are playing in the background that are great food for thought. But I thought that when I look out, all of us, all of you together, we are the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And where better to start than just a quick quote of inspiration. Hopefully it serves as our true north for tonight, not only in our discussion, but also in the work that everyone is doing. And I'll just go ahead and read this. Dr. King said, "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality." And I think that that is exactly the essence and spirit of the discussion that we're having here tonight, and why it is that we're tackling a subject that we're not going to be able to tonight solve, but we are going to continue to put important questions on the table, as well as drive accountability in our community, firstly with ourselves and with leaders. And so I now have the pleasure of introducing our extraordinary panelists. And in order to make sure that we hear the bios of everyone, I'm going to ask that you hold your applause until the end. But then when we're done, let's give them a really, really loud applause, because that's the correct way to do it. And first off, we have Ruben Roberts. Ruben is CEO and founder of RER Consulting Enterprise, a training, professional development, strategic planning, and management services firm. Ruben, thank you so much for joining us. As I said, we'll hold an applause, but we're appreciative. We're also joined by Howard Simon. Howard has been the state affiliate executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union for more than 4 decades. He's the longest serving ACLU state director in the nation. We are also joined by Dr. Tamika Hobbs of Florida Memorial University. Dr. Hobbs is an assistant professor of history and the university historian for Florida Memorial University. Dr. Hobbs has worked closely with the South Florida People of Color's Unity 360 Community Race Dialogue program since its inception in 2016 as a facilitator and curriculum designer. And finally, I have the pleasure of welcoming Adonia Simpson. Adonia is with the Family Defense Program for Americans for Immigrant Justice. She's been practicing immigration law since 2009 in both the private and nonprofit sector. AI Justice's Family Defense Program officially started this last summer in the wake of the policy changes following the elections. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Let's give them a big round of applause. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right, so we're going to get comfortable, and hopefully we're going to get to dig in on the tremendous expertise that all of you bring to the table tonight. And I want to start off with a question. And because we're trying to move through a lot of content, my ground rule for our panelists is we want to keep it short and sweet, because we ultimately want to be able to have a nice exchange and Q&A with some of our friends who are in the audience. So, Ruben, I want to start off with asking you a question, which is really around why is it we are seeing an overrepresentation of African American youth in the juvenile justice system? What are the leading and contributing factors based upon your professional opinion and the work that you've led in our community?
Thank you. That's a good question, Saeed. I think there's a number of factors that play into that. Before I get into that, I want to let you know where that information comes from in terms of the percentage. So African American youth between the ages of 10 and 17 make up 21% of the state of Florida. Anglo youth make up 44%, and Hispanic youth make up 30%. However, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? All right. As I was saying, African American youth make up about 21% of the state of Florida from the ages of 10 to 17. Anglo youth make up about 44%, and Hispanic youth make up about 30%. Out of those youth, African American youth are more likely, 3 to 1% more likely to be arrested. So you have, in terms of arrests, African American youth have been arrested 61% of the time, compared to Anglo youth 33% of the time. One of the things that you'll see is that in the communities that are heavily policed, the high crime communities, that sort of thing, those African American youths that live in those communities often have a lot of negative contact. So they have this program called Disproportionate Minority Contact that was created by the Office of Juvenile Justice, the federal office. And so what that program does is measures the relative rate of index of the racial disparities, if you will. And so what you'll see is that with African Americans, because of the poverty, they can't afford counsel. So if they're getting detained, they won't have any representation other than a public defender, which will likely, lead to them pleading to charges and doing time and that sort of thing. They're oftentimes targeted because of racial profiling. And so the things that may happen, the very same thing that may happen in a more affluent neighborhood, the African American youth will be arrested for, where that youth in that more affluent neighborhood may be given a pass. So for example, there have been instances where law enforcement officers may detain a youth with marijuana, a bag of marijuana. In the case of the African American youth, he will be arrested. And in cases, this is not in every case, but in cases with the Anglo youth, they will just throw the marijuana away and call their parents and send them on their way. And so those are some of the factors that are leading to the number of arrests for African American youth and why they're so high. The other part of that is so very important is that once they are a part of the criminal justice system, it's very hard for them to come out. And so that whole concept of the school to prison pipeline is created. And so one of the things that DMC is charged to do is really reduce the number of negative contact with law enforcement. And hopefully I answered your question.
Thank you so much. And I'm coming right to Dr. Hobbs, and because I think that we're fortunate that in the assemblage of leaders that we have here, we also have a scholar and a historian. And I think that a lot of what you opened up, Ruben, begs the question for us to say, do folks in general understand the complex legacy of racist policies that we see and how those policies have driven a number of the disparities that we're facing today? And so, Dr. Hobbs, I'd love for you to open up a discussion around that, because you're a historian and context matters.
My response
Is that better?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My response to your question, of course, is going to be no. I think that as part of our culture, part of our ethos as Americans, we are encouraged to be forward-thinking, very futuristic. The past is the past and let's move on. But unfortunately, with the issue of race, you cannot understand the divisions, the attitudes, the disparities, unless you study history. And when I say history, I mean broad umbrella history. I think part of the problem that we have that continues to perpetuate itself, and part of what I would argue, and many other scholars argue, is white privilege, is that you have the ability to keep the blinders on. We are given this very sanitized narrative of our history in this country that obfuscates the abuses that African Americans have experienced here. And until we begin to correct that, I think we're always going to have a problem. I take, for example, what we do with the South Florida people of color. Yes, we talk about whiteness and what that is as an identity, the invisible backpack that comes along with that. But what we also recognize very early in the work is that you can't even begin to have a conversation about race if we don't have a baseline understanding of the facts of American history. And so that it's kind of interesting for me that, as a professor, to now get into this race dialogue conversation. But what I've realized is that what I am an expert in, African American history, is absolutely vital for people to be able to come in and understand. And so what you will find in a lot of what we do is that we start by reading and exploring Black history. And it's astonishing. In the first round that we did, I had the privilege of using my book, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida, which talks about lynching in this state. And the reactions that I got from our participants, I had someone say to me that they had not been affected in the way that they were affected by reading my book since they were delving into literature around the Holocaust. And, it begs the question, how can that be? This happened here. This happened to us. And because we don't have that framework, because you don't understand that Blacks living in Florida had the highest likelihood of being lynched of any Blacks in the entire United States of America, that between 1882 and 1950 there was something like 5,000 people who were killed, that police were involved in covering up and executing some of these killings, that the criminal justice system absolutely failed to do anything to address this. If you don't understand that, then you can't understand Black Lives Matter and why we get upset about Trayvon and Jordan Davis and Mike Brown. We are upset about this now because it strikes a very familiar nerve. But how can we ever come to that understanding if we don't have a common sense of history? So I think that's part of the work that we have to do. I wanted to reply to Ruben's comment or just add on to it. When we talk about why we are so willing to, I have to put it in the broad context first. Black lives are disposable, have been historically in this country. We have historical evidence to prove that, and the facts of history also tie into the psychology and the thinking that still lives with us today. But when we talk about Black children, there's a social psychologist by the name of Philip Goff out in the West Coast, I think UCLA, who published an article that's been pretty groundbreaking. The title of it is Essence of Innocence. And what he was able to do is present evidence to two different groups. One were college students, others were police officers. And what he found routinely is that Black children, Black male children, were seen routinely as 5 years older than they actually were. And by both groups were found to be culpable at a rate that far exceeded white youth. So what does that say? It says that people who end up on juries, law enforcement officers, automatically assume that Black boys are older and more responsible than they actually hold other people to. And when you look at the implications of that, and that would fall under the umbrella of implicit racial bias, these are the things that we carry with us. It has real impact on who gets sentenced. So when we talk about real life and what happens with disparities are rooted in these attitudes that we have. And until we can get honest about the attitudes, we're never going to be able to fix the system.
Thank you for that, sharing that perspective. And I know that we have in the audience former State Senator Dwight Bullard, and it'd be great during the Q&A, because Dwight was a leader in the halls of power in Tallahassee, to give us some perspectives on whatever could be the policy rationale behind some of the systemic policies that you talked about. And you also talked about that notion of culpability, which is inherently and the notion of inherent bias that we see within the lens of the criminal justice system. And it is a good segue in some regard to some of the work that is out there from the Equal Justice Initiative and folks like Brian Stevenson. I would imagine many of you are familiar with that work, but if you have not read his book, Just Mercy, it really brings to a head a lot of these questions, particularly through the criminal justice system as it pertains to the death penalty and young men of color. And it just is an alarming book that oftentimes when you're working with youth or anyone, folks of any age, that can really put those questions on the table in an extraordinary way. That leads to this notion of the environment that we're in. And I think that we're fortunate to have this assemblage of leaders here, and within it is somebody who's spent his professional life engaged in battling on the behalf of the Constitution. And that's Howard and the work that he and his team have done at the ACLU. And coming out of what your comments were, Dr. Hobbs, I'm curious to hear the perspective that the current climate, which we might have a higher degree of awareness around with the rise of louder voices of white nationalism and white supremacy. Those voices were always there. They just happened to have a bigger platform. I'm curious because we now come to this interesting inflection point that allows us to ask the question around these increased activities in hate groups, is that are there ultimately legal limits on hate speech? So, and Howard, your work and the work of the ACLU is front and center around that, the boundaries of what would be considered hate speech, and also thinking through what are those legal limits around that in this climate that Dr. Hobbs and Ruben started to give us some perspective around.
Well, this is not the first time that this country has seen a rise, an increase in white nationalists, white supremacists, or we've seen this periodically. There were periods of time where the Klan largely controlled state governments in this country and large parts of the country. And it's not the first time that the country has had to wrestle with and it's been maybe 50 years or so more. 1969, and the United States Supreme Court has tried to make this distinction. And basically, I'm not a lawyer, so it's been my job for decades to try to supervise lawyers. But I am not, I like to say when I go out speaking, I am not now, nor have I ever been a lawyer. But look, so don't think about it in excessively legalistic terms. What we're trying to do is, as a society and as a legal system and as a judiciary, figure out where the line is between thought and action. If we have a democracy that's devoted to a couple of key principles, one of which is freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, then that's freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, regardless of how hateful that speech or those ideas may be. Those are protected. When you begin to act on those hateful ideas in a way that may threaten other people or certainly stimulate or provoke violence, then that is not protected by the Constitution and can be punished. So in 1969, the standard comes out of a famous case in which there was a Klan rally in suburban Cincinnati, and the head of the Klan was interviewed on local TV and said some hateful things on TV and then was arrested. And what the court said, basically, is that no, hateful things that are said are protected by our Constitution. It's when you begin to act on those things, when you begin to incite violence against other people. It's not simply words are actionable. You can be punished for words. If you try to incite violence, you're using words, and that is certainly punishable. But it's when the words turn into incitement or encouraging people to commit acts of violence. So hateful ideas are protected in our system, but action on that is not. You have to think about principles. This is why the organization that I've worked for so many years, I have to say, is a very strange organization. I admit that. It takes strange people because these are people who have to look beyond the facts. Don't look at the facts. What are the principles that are going to govern us that may apply in different factual situations? So, I mean, the best example that I like to think of is the famous Supreme Court case from 1948, in which
giving us that additional context. And I think now more than ever, for many individuals that are here and leaders in the community, it sounds trite to say it, but everyone should really know what their rights are and understand and appreciate in the public square that what those civil liberties indeed are. And at the same time, be mindful of the types of situations that can arise. I mean, it's in public settings, there are opportunities for anyone in a free society to be able to express themselves, and especially for those of you who are engaged and involved in curating and establishing fora, it's important that you have a sense of what those rules and responsibilities are.
So I want to add to that for a second. Now, I mean, I think what I said, even though I tried to say don't be excessively legalistic, I think I might have lurched into that. But I want to talk for a second about the political benefits of what happened when the legal system in our country allowed that rally in Charlottesville. Now, it had a horrible ending, of course, and it's a criminal activity. There are people standing trial for the murder of the counter-protester. But look, what are in our society, there are benefits to allowing people to expose themselves for what they stand for. And how much better off I think we are than trying to drive that on the ground. I personally am grateful for the fact that allowing it to take place and exposing it also really exposed who our president is.
I think that appreciate you sharing that additional perspective. I think that one common theme from the work that each and every one of you is engaged in, scholarship of Dr. Hobbes, is really around this notion of the other, the idea that at different points in time, societies find comfort in describing or ascribing a limited degree of value to others and creating the other. And as society has moved throughout its course, particularly American society, we've seen that morph over time, and we've seen, of course, a number of groups that have always been within the wheelhouse of that, of those forms of otherization. And one of those elements within our society, or one of those communities that we have seen an increased otherization around, and I can say this because I'm a proud immigrant. I came to this country, I came to Miami exactly 40 years ago with my parents. And so the otherization of immigrants and creating this narrative of distrust and fear is something that we're seeing in a lot of different quarters within the public square, and most notably now it's translating into actual administrative and federal action. So, Bedonia, I know that we're threading the needle on a couple of different concepts here tonight, including institutional racism, civil liberty, and immigration. But that's why it's can we talk? Can we really talk? Because none of this is like staring at Rubik's cubes, and we're all here trying to work on them together. And that's really what democracy ultimately is about. And we're free to do that in whatever way we want. And so your work is very much focused around being that shield for immigrants. And when the Muslim travel ban occurred back in January, I remember I have a dear friend named Kuram Wahid, who's actually been very involved with MCCJ. He had a really interesting quote or statement he made on social media, which said that following the Muslim travel ban, the amount of lawyers that jumped into action showed that in that moment, although lawyers are extraordinary to be the butt of all jokes, and I know that being a lawyer myself, that it was a moment when we saw the legal community be the shield. And I know the work that you've been engaged in has been very much around that, although no heroics are are part of the humility you bring. But I'm wondering if you could shed some light on what are the actual consequences and implications of a number of these policy changes to local immigrant communities right here in South Florida in this very moment, and what are some of the steps that your organization and other organizations are playing in combating this manifestation of this otherization of immigrants?
It's a fantastic question. The travel ban was just one of many things that we've been dealing with here locally. It started about a year ago with a change in policies with the new administration. Suddenly, previously and under the previous administration, the policy was to really kind of prioritize who is an enforcement priority, who should be removed from the United States. But now that all went out the window. So we see enforcement across the board, people that have lived here for decades, people who have U.S. born children here. We're seeing additional policy changes. Look what just happened a couple of months ago with DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Young people that were brought here when they were under 16 that have gone to school here, many of whom never found out that they weren't even documented until they applied to college. Right? Think about that. And then just last week, temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is granted to countries who are suffering from either an environmental and natural disaster or civil strife. And Haiti has had it since the earthquake. And not only had they had the earthquake, but then it followed by a hurricane, and then cholera, and then they even got hit by Maria and Irma, not to the biggest effect as previously, but that's now been terminated. So not only do we have a big population of undocumented people here in South Florida, we have a growing number of people that are going to be falling out of status. You know, people that have been working here, contributing to our societies, buying homes, opening businesses, and now these individuals are also vulnerable. So there's been a lot going on. It's been, as an advocate, I feel like every day we wake up and it's something else. I try to stay off Twitter because nothing good is coming out of that.
Although you can tweet, can we talk, really talk,
Please do.
MCCJ_Miami.
Please do. Yes, please tweet that. But what are we doing? So some of the impact of this, of the shifting policies and the things that are happening in our community is fear. You know, there's some immigration remedies and avenues for people when they report crimes, when they're survivors of domestic violence or survivors of human trafficking. And now more and more clients that are coming into our office, we're intaking them and asking them about their cases, and they've been victims. They've been victims. And my question is, you know, did you call the police? Well, no, because I'm afraid they're going to call ICE. I'm afraid immigration is going to come. And this is not an immigration issue. This is a community safety issue as far as the reporting of crime. So the fear in the community is palpable, and it grows every single day. Every time we have a new shift in policy, it's amazing. Our office gets flooded with calls. So what are we doing about it? We're trying to educate the community, because many people actually don't know that under our Constitution, immigrants do have rights, regardless of your status, whether you are undocumented or a U.S. citizen. You have rights under this Constitution, and we're trying to educate folks on how to know their rights, first of all, how to use their rights. One of the things I often say is your rights are a muscle. If you're not using them, they atrophy, and it's scary. And I'm going to be honest, your rights are potentially going to be violated, but that's what we're here as the ACLU and the Americans for Immigrant Justice. We're here to hold them accountable for those actions. So we're trying to do education, which I think is really critical right now. But the fear, as I mentioned, the fear is palpable.
I think one of the things, as you're talking about fear and the response that your organization has provided, that I think it's important for us who live in South Florida to really keep in mind, is that our institutions matter. And we've got here, and I don't want to shout out everyone, but we've got a wide range of institutions that are leaning into these difficult and important and necessary social justice issues, whether those are leaders in the faith-based community. We've got, I know, the Greater Miami Jewish Federation here. We've got the Coalition of South Florida Muslim Organizations. We've got the American Jewish Committee. We've got a wide range of other clerical leaders that are here, and others that are in the field. And so when we think about this factor of otherization, it's also important for us as citizens to recognize and celebrate and support our institutions, because when we see ourselves and when we see this rising, looming threat against liberty, against our ability to be our truest selves in the public square, these institutions are the places that we can take great comfort. And I wanted to share something. I'm coming to you, Dr. Hobbs. I wanted to share something with everyone. So I'm somebody who I'm fortunate to be able to, I get messages and communications from the widest range of people in this community on just about any and every topic, and I love to promote radical transparency around things. And so I got a message earlier this week from somebody who took umbrage with the panel and took umbrage with this forum, and said to me something to the effect, I could read it, but then I have to go on my phone and scroll through it. I don't want to do that. But basically said something to the effect that this is a great panel, great discussion. I actually didn't say it. It said that, well, you're having this panel and this discussion, but it seems like it's preaching to the choir. What about addressing the realities of middle-class whites in America? So that's for you. That's for you, because I promised this person that I was going to bring it up the same way that I felt uncomfortable bringing it here. I'm going to bring it right back. So, and I think it's important. If we're talking about otherization and we want to be able to have a spirit of courage, we started with Dr. King and we started in that spirit. We have to be in that. And I know that the work that you do and your research is about framing historical context. So how do we answer these types of questions?
Yeah, we don't have to talk later about this gift that you're giving me.
Yes, yeah.
But it actually works out, because I raised my hand because I wanted to kind of offer a different perspective on what Howard offered. And I completely understand the position of the ACLU. I'm completely grateful for the work that's been undertaken in the history of that organization. But it's, there's a difference between, unfortunately, what is legally allowable and the consequences of it. You study the history of Black folks in this country, what you will see is that the temperature of the society has either helped or hurt the advancement of groups like African Americans, I think in the modern context, LGBTQ folks. It's what we allow air and what we allow to fester that ultimately changes minds and then eventually changes laws and changes policy. What concerns me about what I've seen with Donald Trump and on the campaign trail, because my spidey sense was tingling, and what I've continued to see him do is that he is giving air to very ugly impulses that we haven't seen really since the Civil Rights Movement. I think one of the things with the Civil Rights Movement, in addition to the policy changes, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is that socially it became unacceptable to talk in these ways in the public. And it kind of allowed for this marginalized group of people to move and maneuver in a certain way. Now what I see and what I hear, what concerns me greatly, is this encouragement, this emboldening of people on the margins who feel like they are losing, to kind of get to your point about groups of people who have come out and really supported Donald Trump, not for economic issues, because I think one of the stats that I provided in the slides is that, we want to say that it was the working class whites that elected Trump. Sure, they are a very strong contingent for him, but according to the Pew Research Institute and some of the statistics that they have provided, it is cultural anxiety, white anxiety, that is really driving and motivating so many people to support him. And that anxiety is what I saw in Charlottesville. And studying American history, what you also see is that white anxiety very often leads to the abuse of people of color, Black folks, and other folks. And that's the thing that makes me nervous. I can't be a historian of lynching and not be worried about those things. And that's something that I think we have to be concerned about. Yes, you want to protect the free speech. And I know legally we may not have a stance, but I think that kind of brings us back to why it's so important for us to talk, is that been used. I'm going to reclaim a phrase. When we talk about the silent majority, I want to believe that there is a majority of you know, I'm going to run into some, let's choose the words wisely. People who get it and who recognize that what Trump represents is not the direction that we want our country to go in. And we need those voices to stand up. I wrote an op-ed for the Miami Herald that was connected to some of the work that we did this summer with the South Florida people of color. We had two very great sessions in July in the Miami Shores Community Church, and there was some powerful dialogues that took place. And one was about one white woman expressed the loudest voice in our country with Donald Trump. I mean, that's the great misfortune for it, and the energy that you see coming behind that. But that article was published the day before Charlottesville, and the day before Heather Heyer lost her life. And it just really illustrates what we're talking about here. So I think there's a lot of power around the room, in this room and in other rooms, that we need to mobilize and organize. I don't think I answered your question.
You know, and I want to give Howard a chance to share some perspective on that. And Ruben, I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you, as well as seek your feedback.
I just have something short to say. I want to take a crack at preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
I don't mind preaching to the choir, because the choir still needs somebody to hand out the music. And so if there are some people that cannot see the injustice that is plaguing the state of Florida, shame on them. But the choir that's here, they at least need to be informed and organized and figure out how we're going to collectively take effective action to protect people on TPS status, to protect the DACA kids. And next year will be probably the most consequential year in Florida political history, maybe in a long, long time. Some of our most fundamental values are going to be up for grabs. The right to vote, religious liberty, the separation of church and state, privacy, and so on. All of those things are probably going to be on the ballot. And so I don't mind preaching to the choir if we can help organize the choir to be an effective voice.
Thank you for that. I also have to say, this is a beautiful choir, so just give yourself some round of applause, because we are, yeah, let's do that. Ruben.
Yes. So
Jump right in. I have no question for you. I mean, this is where we wanted to get to. This is now, the question is, can we talk, ... Can we really talk? Now we're really talking.
Yeah, we're in it now.
Okay, go for it, man. Go for it.
So I just want to say, one of the questions I want to ask everyone to think about regarding race in America is, we must ask ourselves, what's the purpose and function of race? There's no scientific function for race. It's a social, cultural construct, all right, that is fairly new. When you look into the 1700s, in European culture, people were identified by their ethnicity, not so much their race. So what's the purpose of race? And when we look at these other constructs that exist, when we talk about immigrants, how are we going to kick people out of a country that we don't even belong to, right? So again, when you look at these social constructs that exist and how they are utilized, it is a firm example of privilege. Those who have the privilege make the rule. And those who don't have the privilege suffer from the rules. And so one of the things I'm seeing now is this new phenomenon. Today I woke up to Matt Lauer being fired from NBC. Before Matt Lauer got fired, you had Al Franken, Bill Cosby, you had Harvey Weinstein. These are major power brokers. So when you look at these folks who are making the rules, who have privilege, right? And they are being challenged for bad behavior. That's because folk put skin in the game. The way that we're going to address race or racial discrimination or any of those social injustices, I think Dr. Hobbs was alluding to, is that everyone has to have skin in the game. You can't just have African Americans talking about the racial discrimination that's happening with them. So folk who are not African American need to be bold enough and strong enough to stand when they hear of those types of injustice. So they see those types of things happening in their workplace, in their home, in their communities, wherever they are. So the real talk about this is let's all stand together, because we've seen it in recent weeks with the sexual harassment. As you're talking about one of the most powerful persons in NBC, Matt Locke, got fired today because someone reported it. And I'm sure this is not something new, but the trend now is that it's not socially acceptable. We need to move to the place to where racism, discrimination is no longer socially acceptable.
I think that one thing that I want to
We're in a post-racial society.
one thing that I want to say, and as I was preparing for this evening, that I think probably opens itself up for a rich dialogue, maybe in 2018, is a conversation around gender dynamics, and more than ever, and the operative misogynistic culture that we see, and also the role that men have to play in combating that misogynistic culture. And that's something I knew we would get to at some point tonight. The other thing that I wanted to just jump in and anecdotally say is that you talked about the idea of privilege. I think that very much connected to that is the idea of building bridges. And the next dialogue series on December 6th is going to get into the solutions making aspect of this work. But it's important to know that what MCCJ has already done is that we've seen these organic forms of collaboration. I want to share something in particular that coming out of an MCCJ Can We Talk previous dialogue, there was an opportunity for the Muslim community through Cosmos to be able to work with Miami-Dade College in establishing an Islam Today lecture series. And that happened right here. And so while all of us are starting to get our blood pressure going and we're thinking about these issues, I think that one of the best ways is to really channel that into the forms of activity that you're engaged in right now, and also really try to go beyond the barriers that might exist in building bridges with some of the people that are right here tonight. That's a big part of what we're trying to do tonight. It's not just about the pleasantry of a conversation, and you have leaders here who can also be resources for you as you're thinking about what is your role in the public square in doing that. I would be remiss if I didn't do that. I think that we right now are at a point where we'd love to get a little bit more perspective from Adonia around this question of immigrants in our community right now. The resources that are out there are very, very limited. And there's a curiosity around what should each and every one of us be doing to be voices in the public square, in and around what we're seeing is an assault on really the America that we know, in that we are a nation of immigrants, if for those of us that don't have native and tribal heritage.
So one thing that I think is worth saying, that Ruben had mentioned earlier about the juvenile justice system and having a right to counsel, as far as having, if they're unable to afford private counsel, they have a public defender. Many of you may not know, seeing a rise of, and this kind of ties in, dovetails into the racial issues, is Miami-Dade recently changed its policy regarding detainers. So which it means is if somebody is arrested, ICE can put a hold on them and ask that they be held for 48 hours. Most of the people that we're seeing getting picked up on these detainers are folks that are driving without a license. Most of the people that are getting stopped, no, they're not. We're paying for that. So somebody posts their bond, and they're eligible for release. The jail's going to hold them until ICE comes for potentially 48 hours, but that doesn't count a weekend or holidays. So if you're eligible for release on a Friday afternoon and Monday's a holiday, you're not getting out till Wednesday. You're not getting picked up till Wednesday, and that cost of being detained is on us as taxpayers. So I think there's a lot that we can be saying about local policies. There's a lot of organizations that need your support, need volunteers. We need people to be educated on these issues because it goes back to the issue of seeing people as the other. We're all immigrants. We're all immigrants. Not so long ago, this sort of same vitriol was against the Italians and the Irish. You know, we've gone through cycles of this, but now it's becoming it's the Mexican rapist. So there's a lot of things that people can be doing, and I think we need to advocate for change.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Jump in. I picked up on the body language cue.
But just point of clarification.
Please.
We are not all immigrants. Some of us were forced. Our ancestors had no choice here. So I think that's a really important point to make.
Yeah, it's important that we always provide ourselves with appropriate historical context, and so I appreciate you jumping in there, Dr. Hobbs. Adonia, you raised a question that I think is so timely right now, which is this idea of using our voice, expressing ourselves, and especially speaking up for many of those individuals in our community that might not have an ability to express themselves because of just structures and systems in place and just risks they expose themselves to. And that really leads to asking Howard, is freedom of speech at risk at this moment in our society?
Well, I think our democratic institutions are at risk. Oh my God! I mean, just the attack on the press, the effort to delegitimize the press, to try to convince people that the mainstream press that this country relies on to find out what is going on inside government, the effort to delegitimize the mainstream press so that you would then get your information from different sources. You can speculate on what those sources might be. The attack on truth, the notion that there are alternative truths, the attack to participate and vote is a Floridian. 1.6 million. We're going to get this thing on the ballot, and we're going to try to hopefully work together as, speaking to the chorus, getting the chorus united, to drag Florida kicking and screaming out of the Jim Crow era. 1.6 million people who have been blocked from voting in Florida, more than any other state in the country, more than any other country in the world that engages in elections. Florida takes the right to vote away from more people than anywhere else in the world. We were asked to go to the United Nations in Geneva about 2 years ago. I sent a staff member because the United Nations Commission on Human Rights wanted to be here, and they periodically issue reports about Florida. This is the big issue of democracy. I mean, whether or not it's voter ID, whether or not it's voter purges, or in Florida, the most effective voter suppression measure in the country is right here in Florida, the system of lifetime felon disfranchisement that was adopted to rob black people from power after the Civil War. So I hope we're all going to be involved in this battle next year. We will know whether we make the ballot on February 1. If we get on the ballot, we have an opportunity to transform Florida. So anyway, our institutions are tremendously in peril with an attack on every aspect of it, but we have to fight back, and one way of fighting back is get more people into the game.
I think one of the things that I want to just put a plug in for, and we have two great MCCJ former chairs here, both Michelle and Johan Ali, is that part of it is not only making ourselves better aware of what our rights are and stepping up and being voices in the square, but it's also empowering our young people. And one of the things that MCCJ does so magnificently is its Metro Town program, which empowers young people, high school-aged youth in our community around a diversity of experiences, because we know that there are systemic realities that require us to use the rule of law, the courts, media, and other forms of civil action. But it's also important that we're continuing to plant seeds with our young people. And so I would be remiss if I didn't share that. It's a little bit of a commercial, but if you don't know about Metrotown, please check in with Roberta and her team, because if you want to be inspired about what's right as opposed to wailing about all that's wrong, that's how you can check into some real purpose. So Dr. Hobbs, and then I'm going to jump to Ruben.
Just really quickly, I'm glad that you pointed out the racially discriminatory roots of the voter, felon disenfranchisement, because it was something that was encoded. Emancipation happened in 1865, in 1868 in the state of Florida. They encoded that into the Constitution, fully anticipating that it would have the effect of reducing the ability of African Americans to participate politically. There's a great book. Ari Berman wrote a book called Give Us the Ballot, and it traces the modern struggle for voting rights. It's really excellent, and it continues to show how the vote continues to be racialized. I mean, when we look at what we're dealing with now in the world after Shelby County versus Holder, it's all about, the failure to reinstitute those portions of the Voting Rights Act. And then you see these states like Texas, North Carolina, and others that come immediately with these laws. Why? When you look at what happened in 2012, I believe it was the first time in record that African Americans proportionally had a higher voter turnout than whites. And that goes back to the point that we were making about white racial anxiety. This idea that anytime that too many people of color begin to vote and have influence, that we've got to act. Related to that, one of the books that we've used in our dialogues is a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And what she does too is look at the history of this country post-emancipation and look at how every time that there was an opportunity for Black advancement, there was white violence, or more importantly, and that's something that I really wanted to bring into the room tonight, maybe not violence, but violence through policy. Because we can talk about the fact that race isn't real, but racism is. And the way that racism is enacted is through policy. And so part of the work of wherever we're going to change it, we have to begin to examine where racism shows up either in the policy itself. Very often it won't, because it's coded in such a way that it's colorblind, quote unquote. Don't like that word, but we'll use it. And more importantly, the results end up being something that create disproportionality and disparity based on race.
Yeah, and I agree. And you're correct. Race isn't real, but the function of race is real. And so when you take the rights away from thousands of young African American men, and they can't vote, or you put them in a situation and now they have a felony. And it's something as simple as this. So let me paint a picture for you. You have a young man that committed a crime. The police officers that arrested this young man gave him multiple charges, trumped up charges, where he has a felony now, on top of something that was probably a misdemeanor. When he goes to court, he comes from a family where he's poor. He has a bondable offense, but the judge sets the bond for $20,000. Who has $20,000 sitting around? So he has to sit in the jail. Now, if he has a family that he has to take care of, or if he has a job to go to, then he needs to get out, go back to work, or he needs to do whatever. This young man is presented with an offer, a plea deal. We'll give you credit for time served if you agree to take this charge. And so once that young man agrees to be convicted of that charge, now it's harder for him to maintain the job, maintain the employment, or get new employment. So what you do is you create a system that it's a cyclical system that perpetuates this whole thing. And so that's a part of that. It's not just voting rights. I mean, all of that person's rights are violated. The right to work, the right to be able to feed his family, all of those things. And so when you look at how, when you talk about systemic racism, how things are looking from a systemic perspective or institutionalized racism, those are the systems, the educational system, criminal justice systems, two largest systems that have really impacted minorities and have a very negative effect, long-lasting negative effect on those minorities. And so these are the reasons why I shared with you earlier. The purpose of me saying that race is a social-cultural construct is so that we understand that race is used to divide us as a construct, and racism is real, but race has no real scientific basis. And we're using things to divide us over and over again. And sometimes we fall prey. You mentioned Donald Trump. He's the master of it. He's the master of division. And at some point, we really need to, when we go to part 2, we really need to focus on what unites us. Because we have far more in common than we do that's not in common. I think that we really need to look at what do we have in common and how we can promote that and get folks to see on the institutional level, on the personal level, how we can really promote more, being more unified than we are divided.
And I think that that's a good segue to the audience Q&A component. And one thing that I want to say about your comment, Ruben, and I think it's important for tonight and even for the dialogue series that we've created here, that's Can We Talk, is a recognition that this work is, there are multiple forms of otherization that we're seeing in our society that go against sexual orientation. We are seeing this rabid manifestation of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of otherization that are causing just a complete breakdown of so much of our civic fabric. And in our community, we're also seeing these green shoots of hope where communities are coming together that might not otherwise have been able to find common cause. And I think that that's one of those constructive elements of this Can We Talk. I'm proud to share one of those has been in this community, the efforts that the clergy dialogue leads upon, and being able to have our faith leaders, MCCJ, convening our clerical leaders who are able to stand together as brothers and sisters in faith to be able to remind us of where we're going. And there's a whole other range of activities. There's recently the creation of a Muslim-Jewish Advisory Council that involves local leaders from the Muslim community and American Jewish Committee. And these are examples of where President Obama said in his final address this idea of expanding our moral imagination. And I think that if we want to get to that place, that's a big part of this long work ahead. So we want to open it up now for Q&A. This is a great time to do so. I think we might actually have a microphone. Do we have a mic, or is this it?
That may be it, but I'll be happy to
Yeah.
do that. Can people hear me? Yes. Okay, I've got a good one. My name is Gail Price-Wise. I'm the president of the Florida Center for Cultural Competence. I run training programs, what I call managing your prejudices. And in my classes, most of the people that I work with are genuinely ashamed of the prejudices that they have, which is a good thing. So I get people to kind of acknowledge and to learn to recognize, acknowledge their own prejudices and learn how to not act on them. That's an easier thing to do than what I'm going to talk about now. I think part of what's harder about racism is the issue of selfishness and prejudice. The problem is that slavery was so damn convenient for the slave owners. It made them rich to have all these unpaid people working for them. And business owners really benefit a lot.
Can you ask a question?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Well, I guess the question is that how do we address the issue that keeping people down is a benefit to those that are on top? And people that are on top don't want to give up their positions. They don't want people from the bottom rising up because it'll bring them down.
Who wants to jump in first? It's a great question. Thank you.
I actually have a question for you. Why is it managing your prejudices instead of eliminating them?
Because it's so damn difficult to really change your psyche. So at least people should have it rise to the level of consciousness so that they don't act on it. It's so damn difficult to change your unconscious.
Yeah, I thank you for the work that you're doing. That this is really, I'm pleased to know. The language in this is problematic, kind of triggered me a little bit, but that's good. Yeah, I think that it is about sacrifice. I've been reading a book called Dream Hoarder by Richard Reeves, and it's fascinating to me because I'm used to coming to this work from kind of a black-white binary, but what Reeves does is he really approaches it from a class issue. And he focuses not on the top 1%, but I think it's like the top 29% of people in this country that earn more than $100,000, and the way that they vote and the way that they act in order to preserve the resources for themselves. A lot of the NIMBY, not in my backyard type stuff, the maintenance in different ways of residential segregation that, of course, then begins to have an impact on school systems. As a stat that I contributed that talked about the increase of school segregation, what they're calling, I forget the term that they use, apartheid academies, and where there's schools that are either over 90% minority. We have seen an increase in the state of Florida in those types of schools. So I think the revolution that we want is something not that we need to point to other people to create, but we need to be interrogating ourselves and asking the question, what are we willing to give up in order to achieve true inclusion? And that makes it really tough, right? Because we think we worked hard and we deserved all these things. But that's where the education around, and I'm trying to get away from using the term white privilege. There's been a lot of conversation about what that triggers and what that infers. Maybe something like the white advantage, but what we're really talking about is all the benefits that you get from being born white and the history that comes along with. But until we begin to have honest conversations and help people realize that this is not really and truly a meritocracy in this country, that there are real benefits from people being born white, and there's also, as Reeves points out, a real benefit from being born wealthy. People who are born wealthy tend to stay wealthy. We have one of the least mobile societies now in this country. In the globe. It used to be that we were the land of opportunity. That's not the case anymore. And that's not racial, that's economic.
Want to jump in, Ruben?
Sure. So I like your question, and I just want to piggyback. This is where I was going all evening. Again, the whole concept of race is for the division. And the purpose of that is so those people, I think, in the top 1% can maintain and keep their wealth. And those who are beneath that, struggle. So who do they utilize? They utilize those people from that's in between. So for example, we have this new tax law. Trump says the middle class. So the people in Appalachia think that $50,000 or $100,000 is the middle class. He's not referring to them as middle class. He's referring to people that makes $250,000 or more. That's their middle class. And so what happens is he's fighting for the middle class. This is what he campaigned on. This is the language that's used by, I'm sorry to say it, but I have to say it, white privilege. And this is the dog whistle that they use to those who are not even in their category. So there is a racial component to it, and then there's an economic component to it. The economic component to it is for those who have their wealth to maintain their wealth. And they use the folks in the middle to do their bidding. Same thing if you go back historically to the slavery. So the masters of the plantation used those folks who came over from Europe who were probably indentured servants and that sort of thing, and they shared with them that, listen, these slaves are going to take your jobs. They already had their jobs. They never got paid. So they already had their jobs. So what did they use those folks who were indentured servants and that sort of thing, those folks, the white English people or European people, they used them to be the overseers. And that's where that whole policing came into place. It's the same concept now. That top 1% will use folks of the same race who earn less than them to monitor or control the behavior of other folks who don't look like them. And that concept plays over and over again in our society. It's something that we really need to recognize, because if they ever recognize that they're in the same position as the slave or the minority or whoever it is, if they ever recognize that and they stood together against that top 1%, imagine what would happen. And that's something that doesn't happen.
Let's get a few more questions. Mr. Dwight Bullard.
Two quick questions. Quick ones. Can the panel discuss modern day racial context around legislation and policy? Meaning, examples being like 94 crimes bill, stand your ground, Muslim ban being kind of more modern day examples, and maybe talk about the context of that. The second thing is, can I take a crack at the internet question?
Yeah,
If that's okay.
Yeah, please, I mean,
Okay.
I would love to hear your
In case that person's watching. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, as a student of history, similar to Dr. Hobbs, shout out to Florida A&M University, where we both got rooted in our African
You gotta always watch
historical
out for the
context.
rattlers. They're always there.
We're always in the building.
They're always in the bush.
But I think we've kind of hit touch points on the racialization of that notion of the depression of middle-class white America, right? And what I mean by that is what you see in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, even in Florida, is a failure to acknowledge that as long as there was a group that looked different than me, that was conceivably doing worse than I was, I'm okay with the eradication of my wealth. Meaning that it's been economic policies since Nixon that have eroded the middle class across the board, right? You've seen it ripping away at companies, you've seen outsourcing of jobs, you've seen all of that take place regardless of party, regardless of political affiliation. But as long as you had a clear racial divide, saying that the folks across the tracks, I know they're broke, so I'm fine, that was good. What you saw coming out of the Obama presidency and now moving into the Trump administration is folks feeling as though that had been eroded, that I can't believe it. I'm on the same level as those folks over there. And that is what's making me uncomfortable. So one of the two things has to happen, and what you saw in the reaction in 2016 was, if he's coming to reinsert that boundary that allows me to believe that I'm better than, I'll vote for you overwhelmingly, right? But if you're not going to do that, then there's going to be a level of outrage. And now you're still having to deal with the fact that your job's being lost, that factory's still being closed, that all those things are happening. So I think there needs to be an acknowledgement of where some of that rage was coming from, was the fact that I see too many brown doctors, I see too many black lawyers, I see too many folks who are who feel as though they're the economically equal to where I've been or where I want to be. And so therefore my reaction has to be to reinsert that division.
Thank you for shedding light tonight. So Dwight asked an important question about the legislative context and of some of the systemic racism that we're seeing that presents itself in policy. So have at it, panel. Jump in.
Well, I'm just to say, in regards to the Muslim ban, it was an executive order. It was a poorly planned executive order that has had 3 or 4 iterations now, gone up and down the court system, and the last version of the travel ban is extremely interesting because now it's incorporated a couple of other countries, including Venezuela and North Korea, right? So I don't know if we'd be visiting there, but I don't think it'd be very easy for the pieces. But so that's just a clarification. But so that's just a clarification. As far as what the Muslim ban was, it was an executive order, and it was extremely poorly thought out and poorly implemented, and that's why we saw hundreds and hundreds of lawyers at the airport trying to represent people.
Anybody else want to jump? I'm leaning in and there's no microphone here. I just want to it's all right. It's all right. That's just where and now we're really talking because you're not even a microphone. So.
Dwight, I just was going to add, Dwight mentioned stand your ground, and I think that too is a function of the gun lobby. And the way that people defend that is that, this idea of the extension of castle doctrine, and we should have the ability to defend oneself. But again, the disparity comes in the application. You're much more likely to be successful using a stand your ground defense if you're white, and if your victim is a person of color. And so it's been one of my great disappointments after 2012. I was greatly affected by the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Our university has a relationship with the Trayvon Martin Foundation, and that it's located on our campus. But the inability to address and change that law, and then actually we've seen the reverse. Daniel Webster has actually upped the ante to even make it easier to kind of shoot and walk away. And so I think that that's a really something that has a painful legacy that's still very much with us. To the second point that Dwight made about addressing the question about the middle class it's working class whites is the language that we're using. I think it's really interesting that, Steve Bannon and some of these Republican operatives criticize the Democratic Party for their identity politics, right, for the black groups, LGBTQ, but they have masterfully, through this last election cycle, done the same thing around working class whites and created, a very loyal contingency that's going to show up and vote for them. And I think it all goes back to the idea of loss. People feel like they're losing something, which is directly connected, as he pointed out, to race. It was all right in this country. Part of the wages of whiteness, psychological wages of whiteness, is the phrase that W.E.B. Du Bois uses, is that I don't care how poor I am, if I live in a shack, if I'm not eating too good, at least I ain't black. And I think a hard reality for many whites in this country is that when they see people of color around them doing better, this is not the America that's not how it's supposed to work here. White people are always supposed to be living better than everyone else. And when that's not the reality, it creates some real friction. And people are looking for answers, and I think the Republicans and Donald Trump in particular have masterfully used that negative energy to power. The question is for us, what are we going to do about it?
So let's get some more questions. Let's keep the questions quick. Let's keep the responses also quick because we've got a great audience here. Chuck.
I don't. Yeah. Okay. One thing, I think the theme of the EU is elections are consequences, and it's not just national election. I want to ask something about the judges. You were talking about the criminal justice system. The judge sets the bond that creates that cycle that perpetuates, and it's just a vicious cycle that goes on. I think that we forget that judges are elected, and I know for a fact, my friends call me on election day. Who am I supposed to vote for? I don't know anything about any of these people, okay? And they might know about some of the issues, maybe a referendum or something there, but the judges, nobody, okay? You have to research. Look at what their decisions are. It's so important. So I just wanted to keep that in mind. Next time you go vote, before you go there, look at the judicial races. It's really, really important.
Unfortunately, the people that are impacted by that aren't able to vote, mostly. So
But if we can educate these parts.
I agree. I agree that the education part is definitely key. But I just wanted to share with you, sometimes folks don't have that information because they're not speaking to those folks who are impacted by it directly.
So another question is there anything being done with the judicial system and judges to educate the judges themselves maybe about implicit bias?
I know on the juvenile court level, they have to have training. There are so many hours of training that judges have to have each year. And so I know that they cover some of those issues in the training that they're required to have each year. I'm not sure about what happens on the adult level. I don't know.
So I'm going to just jump in and say that the Florida Bar has a diversity cohort that Judge Bernstein here helps to lead statewide in deep diving around implicit bias and a number of these other constructs that are really blinding certain judges in making impartial decisions. And it's probably not as robust as it could be, even though Judge Bernstein and many others have done some very, very good work. But it also speaks to the reason why all of us need to try and support and resource those actors in the public square that are doing that. A lot of that happens, as we know, and you know this, from our volunteer bar associations and other type associations that are doing difficult work. I know I can speak just quickly in the Muslim community. The Florida Muslim Bar Association has leaned in providing a lot of those types of sensitivity and trainings around bias against American Muslims. and that's really in a number of different communities helped change it. But it's just it's never enough. Howard, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, let me say that I appreciate the need to address implicit bias. It's always important to do so. But I'm sorry, I'm a policy person. And I think what we have to do is change the policies in which people operate that lead to the crisis that we are now. I think making judges more sensitive is not going to change the fact that we have a bail system that depends upon money. And we have a money bail system. Making people more sensitive is not going to change the fact that the legislature for decades has played politics with the criminal justice system and loaded up mandatory minimum sentencing and filled the prisons with largely young black men. So no amount of implicit bias training is going to deal with that. We have to do, the people of New Jersey last year rose up and ended their money bail system. States all over the country are ending mandatory minimum sentencing because at least even the conservatives have recognized that it's too expensive to maintain that. Every state of the South, except Florida, has changed their criminal justice system. That's a movement that we need to lead, and if we change the system in which people operate, then maybe we'll have we'll always have to deal with implicit bias, but we have to change the structure within which biases are allowed to run free.
Donia, I think you were edging forward. You wanted to jump in on this one?
I'm good.
You're good. All right, next question. Carol.
Sure, I'm sorry, please.
My question is for Dr. Yesterday only I read a statement from the Archbishop of Canterbury. He said he had to say what he thinks, that he can understand how come there are so many evangelical Christians in the United States who defend Donald Trump. I don't know much about evangelical Christian history in this country, so I don't know from history perspective if you could provide some understanding of it. I'll send it to the Archbishop.
I won't. I'm not a religious scholar, or religion has not been something that I've studied extensively. I'll say that first. But again, the lens through which I view the world is one through race, and it has been historically true, and it still is true that the 11 o'clock hour on Sunday is one of the most segregated in America. I tend to see the evangelical Christian issue tied up with white racial anxiety as well. I think they're very concerned about cultural changes, about abortion issues, about LGBTQ and gay marriage, and we saw under the administration of George Bush that coalition really strengthening itself. And I think over the years of the Obama administration, that has been kind of a really healthy recruiting ground for the Republicans. And there's this really interesting relationship because there was money coming out of the Bush administration for this compassionate conservatism, and that drew kind of the church closer to the state. I think that Trump understood the evangelicals and some of their needs. There's this proposal now to, is it the Johns Amendment, that prevents the IRS, well, it's something, they want to pull it back because right now as it stands, if you have a politically active church, you can lose your nonprofit status and be charged tax. They want to do away with that, which is going to just draw that relationship even closer. And these ministers, megachurches in particular, and the numbers in that denomination it's a lot. And so there is a political advantage to that relationship. But I mean, in terms of kind of the history of it, I think I see it through that lens. It is one of the pillars of the America that has been, that people just really want to hang on to, and it's been very effective in that way.
Carol.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Dave, for the shout out to the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. I'm actually here wearing two hats, and I like using my hands. Thank you. I'm wearing two hats because there's a handful of us on the Miami-Dade Community Relations Board as well. Just a point of clarification, if you'll forgive me, because you talked about 501c3 nonprofits not being, churches politically active. That's my wheelhouse. And we are politically active on issues, not candidates. So there's a very clear distinction between legislative and electoral issues. It's what we do every day. We lobby, we are politically active, we just keep away from the candidates and the people, and we stick to the policy issues. I'd like to ask all the panelists why you think those who are most effective, who have perhaps some of the biggest stakeholders in this conversation, are not here tonight. The 40-year-olds. Well, let's see. Yeah. Other than a handful, I'm thinking a handful. I've got nothing against the 60-plus. Why aren't they here? Why aren't they part of this conversation if we really want to have that conversation?
Can I deviate for a second and ask a colleague of mine that's here, Karen Lavernia, that has been my sister in service in this community for a while, and actually serves alongside, we work together at FIU, and she's been very engaged in a lot of those conversations with that cohort you're talking about. I'd love for Karen to shed some light on that. I know I'm just putting you on the spot.
Yes, you
but
are.
I think that a lot of the work in the circles that you're in, the Miami Fellows and others, are the ones leaning into that. So I'd love for you to shed a little bit of light, because Carol asked a great question. I know our panelists can also illuminate on that, but do you want to take a stab at that?
It's a really tough question. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I tend not to talk at these things, which is why my brother in service forces me to talk. So I spent a lot of time at City Year. We were on the founding City Year team. We worked there for 7, almost 8 years. And City Year engages young people in a year of service. And they worked in all throughout Miami, working one-on-one with students and teachers in some of our schools. I saw political activation and embracement of dialogue when it was driven by them, which I think, MCCJ does a great job of that through the Metrotown network. But I saw that a lot when it was driven by the youth. In fact, one of our most popular programs was driven by middle school students and brought out middle school students on Saturday mornings to downtown Miami, 100 of them from all over Miami. And it was led by middle school students. So I'll say that as one thing. The other thing with our community is we're an event-driven town. There are 6 other events going on tonight at the same time. So I think that's another issue. Something that I claim responsibility for is oftentimes I come to these events and I just forget to tell my 5 cousins who are not engaged to come. We all have those cousins, mine are all in Hialeah. They don't engage in the political process. And it's my responsibility as someone who understands the issues a little bit more to encourage them or pick them up and bring them to dialogue programs like this. And I think, speaking for my community specifically, I think oftentimes we do that and we forget to bring those people who are just not involved. And it's generally in our community a lot of the same people who show up to events on dialogue on these important issues. So we need to be creative about how we get, my cousin in the middle of Hialeah who is 40 and only votes once in a while if the policy is something that he's interested in.
Panel, do you guys want to jump in on that? Dr. Hobbs, are we good?
Make a comment, and I just thought of this now because people are talking about it. It's great. We try to make these events, but this is another great idea. No, you said that. Try to make these events, central in different locations. Trying to go where people, might go and everything like that. But just to give you an idea, I'm in that 40 range, not for much longer, but I am. I had to have food delivered to my home to my child and put him alone in an Uber to get to somewhere else so that he could get baseball so that I could make it here. That's a lot of effort for people of where we are with children and working mothers and all of that. So, but it just gave me an idea that if we're going for that group something, maybe the next thing needs to be in Brickell at a bar or something. But it's a great idea to just food for thought of getting that. I'm glad you pointed it out, and that's something that we need to work on. So we'll think about that. So thank you.
Question at the back here. Thank you so much.
feedback in chat. You are live streaming it. Do they have feedback in chat from the audience?
A little bit.
That's a Johan question. I don't know where Johan went, but.
Yeah, we've had a little, but it hasn't been very, it's more folks listening in for the conversation.
Okay. I was just wondering, because on Eventbrite, I didn't see that as an option.
Other questions? I'm skipping you, good sir. We're gonna get a couple, I think we had a couple more. We'll come back to you if we have some time. Any other questions? Please.
Hi, I'm Robin, and my question is, do we see any dynamic leaders coming forward that we can support?
Everyone hear that?
Yeah.
You mean other than Dr. Tamika Bradley Hobbs?
Oh, no. Well, I don't know. In my community, that has been a touchy question, and I feel sometimes that African American folks sometimes can be a little immobilized because we are looking for that one person. My thoughts about that have tended to veer towards we are all our independent owned leaders, and we need to pick up that mantle and move forward in that way. So I think there's a lot more room for us to let our light shine, whatever level your light illuminates, but get with other people, and it's through those groups. I shouted out on Sunday, we had a film screening of The Great White Hoax by Tim Wise up in Miami Shores, and I shouted out the women's movement because the march and the coalition that has developed, the energy, the conversations, the work, the committees that are being formed, I think are really kind of a wave of the future. In the same way, New Florida Majority, I've been watching what they've been doing for years. I think that is really kind of next level type of engagement. So I tend to move away from kind of any single guy. We need to get together individually and lead.
I also want to just jump in and answer that and say the truth is we're seeing leaders in smaller community-based organizations stepping up, and those are the folks that we should be giving our attention to. Recently, there's a group of Muslim and Jewish women that came together and formed the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, and folks like Shelley Groff, folks like Tessin Siddiqui, who's part of Cosmos. My wife is one of those. Those are the people that don't get celebrated out there in the public square. Folks like Valencia Gunder and the work that she does, those are the people that we should double click on. Those are the people that we should celebrate. Those are the ones that we should try and, when they're out there seeking awareness and resources and energy and momentum, a lot of that's the ultimate nature of why our democracy is such a beautiful and precious thing. So I have a little bit of around that. Howard, jump in.
Well, I want to follow up on what the professor said and support that and indicate that, and maybe this may sound a little bit strange for me, but it'll be a little bit optimistic. Because I don't think we need to be looking for the great leader to emerge. I think we ought to take and look at what has happened all over the country in movements and fighting back that has occurred. The Women's March that occurred after the inauguration and that occurred in communities all over the world, not just in the Women's March in Washington, but all over the world, was almost, I don't want to say spontaneous, there are people that planned it, but there were leaders in every community all over the world that planned that. I have to tell you, I get emotional talking about it because I know good friends who, you know, I sat on my couch that Saturday night, a week or so after the inauguration, and I saw all these lawyers and people show up at airports all over. And when I saw this friend of mine run out of court at midnight in federal court with the TRO, I mean, the people that showed up at airports all over the country, there wasn't a great leader that said that. I mean, it was the use of social media that brought people out. Look at what happened in the pushback that prevented Obamacare from being repealed, and maybe we'll see that more and more. There's a pushback movement that is occurring. So I think there's reason to be optimistic. I think what we have to figure out how to do is not look for the great leader, but how to fuel the movements that are happening locally. And I think there's reason to be optimistic about that. you know, I do think that racial issues have been used to divide this country from day one. This country was born in racism.
That's right.
It was born in racism, and racial issues have been used to hold on to power. Whether it was peace internment program, what an example of one-stop racial profiling. 120,000 people, because of their ancestry, were presumed to be saboteurs with no evidence whatsoever. Now what we're facing is that all Muslims are terrorists and all Mexicans are rapists and criminals and so on. I don't think this is anything new. This is what America is about. It's a constant struggle. I think what we have to celebrate and foster and fuel is the pushback movements that are occurring all over. And I think, you know, I'm going to shout out to the MCCJ for this, because I think some of these movements, they need to be led by the religious community. I mean, I grew up in the civil rights movement. I went south. I worked there for some time, and we ought to reflect on what brought us. I bet many of you were involved in that. What brought you to that civil rights movement? And it was led by an interracial group of clergy. And some of these issues about the Muslim ban, Muslim discrimination, the hostility to immigrants, those are issues that where leadership needs to come, I think, from the religious community generally.
So we're at time. I know that we're going to get to. We got one more question. I know Roberta is a stickler for time, and so I'm mindful as such.
So
please,
I have the last 10 minutes, and I can certainly make it 5.
Okay, great.
I was stimulated by this conversation about who's here and who's not here. And the question I would throw out is, how do we create the sense of urgency like we have created at other times? We are on a college campus, and I think all around us there are classes in session that teachers and professors to have walked their students to this gathering could have filled this hall if there was that sense that somehow, just what we're talking about, something urgent is happening in this country that needs action. And so my question is, how can we stimulate that sense among us of urgency, and the urgency to pay attention to these issues, because at this time, it is a critical time in our history.
Thank you.
I want to say something. I think you're absolutely right. I'm not sure of the efforts to engage the students that were on the campus, but I think that we definitely need to do more engagement, work, and outreach, and have more opportunities for forums like these. I want to also speak to the whole leadership piece. I think that everyone in this room are leaders, and I think your opportunity to lead is what we really need to look at. You have an opportunity to take whatever you've gotten out of this experience tonight and share it with 5, 10, 15 other people. That's true leadership. And so if you can share that information with those in your circle, in your community, and look for opportunities to attend other events like these. So hopefully we'll have more. I know the NAACP, I'm the first vice president. Our president is right there, Dr. Shirley Johnson. We've had forums where we've touched on issues like where's the justice. We've had forums where we talked about unity in the community, and we'll continue to have those series of forums. But the other thing I think that's most important is that if you're not associated with an organization like this one, or the ACLU, or the NAACP, or any other organization that you'd like to see yourself a part of, leaders emerge from doing that type of work in those types of organizations. So I would encourage you to find an organization that fits good with you and participate in those organizations.
Anybody else want to jump in before we close out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the challenges we're facing, particularly in the immigration context, is every single day there's a new urgency, there's a new issue, there's a new fire we're trying to put out. And, to go back to the leaders, I think what's really important is storytelling, putting faces, putting people's stories out there that are impacted by these issues, And I think to transition this over to Heather, I think what's really great about this program is it's on Facebook, I believe. People can tune in and people can come back, right?
So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a big round of applause for
Thank you all so much for that segue. My name is Heather Burdick, and I'm the program director with MCCJ. I think it's interesting that we were talking about trying to create that sense of urgency. I think younger folks do have a sense of that urgency. I think that they're just kind of over the talking and are ready for action, which is another perfect segue into our next meeting. So next time we meet together, it will be a working group. And before you leave today, I'm going to ask that you sign up for one of the 4 areas that we've touched base on. And then we're going to be kind of rolling up our sleeves. Right here at that first chair, I'm going to have a pile of your homework assignments. I'm going to ask also if you know someone who is pretty active in this area, who you think, or in one of these areas, who you think can add to the conversation, to go ahead and invite them to come with us next week. We're not looking for someone new to the game, you know, who missed out on the conversations tonight, but somebody who's pretty aware of what's going on in that area and can kind of really help us out. So one of the things that we're going to ask you to do first off is to choose an area, sign up before you leave. You're going to talk about what stood out most to you tonight, something that really sparked your interest or gave you some new insight. Something that could have been added to the conversation to give a fuller perspective. If there were any kind of glaring omissions of perspective, a plan of action moving forward, and what capacity you have to help make that happen. And then one of the exciting things that we're going to ask you to do is to think of 10 people in the city who can help move forward, really create change in this area. So maybe we can get those 10 folks into the space and really kind of push some movement. So that's all I have, and I thank you all.
So I want to once again thank Scythe and this wonderful panel. You know, in the preparation for this and the back and forth notes that were going, I couldn't wait, really, because I could see the depth and I knew what was coming tonight, and I knew